Hi, I'm Bryan Moyers, and today I'm going to talk to you about an interesting finding from genetics that I call junkyard genes. Humans are special because we can think creatively in ways that other species can't. But what is it about us that makes us special? And for that matter, what makes any given species special in its own way? Well, part of the answer is in genes. Genes are small sections of DNA which perform a specific function in the body. Most of DNA is not genes, and it's what we refer to as junk DNA. It's doing something, but not the same kinds of jobs that genes are. Now, you'll remember from high school biology that all species have genes, but not every species has the same number of genes. For instance, fruit fly has 15,000 genes, whereas humans have 22,000 genes. And if you look at all these genes and compare them, many of them look very, very similar and are doing the same job in each of the organisms. So we call those the same genes. But there are a large number of genes in each species that other species don't have. And since we know that they had a common ancestor, we know that since these species have diverged, they've been gaining new genes. The question is, where did these new genes come from? One possibility is duplication. Sometimes when a new organism is born, a piece of the DNA is copied twice, and this is a duplication. And typically after a duplication, one of the two copies is changed slightly to perform a slightly different job. And you can think of this as something like a car that's been modified to be, say, a police officer vehicle. You've added some sirens and a few other modifications, and so it's doing a similar job, but slightly different. Another possibility is that you take some of this junk DNA, and where there was no gene, a gene appears. And this is more like a bunch of junk from a junkyard being rammed together and suddenly making something useful. And if you're skeptical about this, you're not alone. Since the molecular evolution, most biologists have thought that this is an extremely unlikely thing to happen. By comparison, duplications happen pretty frequently. Nylon, for instance, was invented in 1935, and the world had never seen it before. But 40 years later, we found a strain of bacteria that was eating it. And a closely related strain of this bacteria couldn't eat nylon. And the question is, what is it that made one strain be able to eat nylon and the other one not? And it turns out that the strain that could eat nylon had had a duplication of a single gene, and that duplicated gene had been changed in a way that allowed it to eat nylon. So we know that duplications can happen frequently and quickly, and this has been thought to be where most new genes come from. But there's a problem. Sometimes we'll look in humans and we'll find a gene that no other species has, and it doesn't look like any gene in humans. And this is kind of like finding a really bizarre bicycle and realizing that it doesn't look anything like any of the other vehicles that we have, and saying, well, how did we create this new novel item? Well, we're going to return to the idea of junk DNA, because it turns out that all throughout junk DNA there are these switches that are being turned off and on and off and on all throughout the genome every few generations. And I'd like to introduce the idea of the junkyard gnome, and you can think of this as a creature running around the junkyard, picking things up and saying, is this useful? Nope, not that. How about this thing? Not that either. But really, since this is happening all over the genome all the time, it's more like an army of junkyard gnomes, running around picking up things and throwing them around trying to find something useful. Most of the time, this is all going to be useless, but every once in a while, you'll find something that actually performs a function. And usually, it's going to perform that function very poorly. It's kind of like finding a bike that's broken down and convoluted and barely works. And so even though it's not fun to use, it can still do things that your other vehicles can't. It can get into narrow spaces and it can go off-road. And after several generations, you can spend time fixing this bike up and tuning it up and making it better, and eventually you'll have a very well-functioning new gene. So this is a cool, interesting finding, but it's not just a matter of, some origins question. There are really strong effects of how this might influence us. For instance, since most of the new genes are turned on in the brain, maybe these really do have something to do with why humans can think creatively. Or maybe they're involved in a lot of brain disorders like dementia. There are a lot of major unanswered questions here that we're still going to be investigating in the future, and that's